Ma'am, participants include both research scholars and teachers.
Okay, no problem. So, talking with the strategies and the steps in the research process. So first of all, what is research? Research is basically a systematic study, or it is something systematically organized search for a new and better insight. It is, you see, a quest to bring out accurate and deep meaning and the truth of the problem. So many research that results may be useful for improving the social conditions. They may be useful for improving the political conditions, economic conditions, or the societal conditions as a whole, besides scientific studies. So the ultimate responsibility of the research is just to seek the truth of that problem on which the researcher starts working. So the research process is a process of multiple scientific steps. In conducting the research work, various steps are to be followed by the researcher. And there are different steps when a researcher starts research, like research problem, research questions, research design, data collection, and then how to analyze that data, how to disseminate the result of that data. So each step is interlinked with other steps. They do not work in the exclusivity. They work with jointly. So at each stage, the researcher need to follow certain strategies and certain standard norms to come out with a research result that may lead to the truth, that may lead to the objectivity, that may lead to the answer to that problems on which the researcher has started working. Now, one of the questions that is, why do we do research? What is the reason why there are researches? So we all know that the society in which we live, that is not a static society. Every time there are changes, social values changes, attitudes changes. So everything is keeping on changing. And for that, research is required also for the changing situations, because once there is something which has been done by a researcher, that may not continue forever because of this metamorphosis in the society. And to cope with the changing social values and to cope with the changing social attitudes also, the research is required. And again, you see, in the era of the scientific and technological developments, new problems, new complex human relationships, and various other complexities you see are seen. And that also needs some new researches to be done. So in such situations, research and particularly legal research becomes very necessary to deal with the upcoming situations, to deal with the new problems, to deal with the new complexities which are coming up because of various reasons. And basically, if we talk about the research, then in legal research, it is done in order to know and in order to determine the law on a given subject or on the given topic in the given area. And it is also to highlight the ambiguities, some of the vaguenesses, and if there is certain weaknesses in the existing law, so that is also to be examined and that is also to be determined. So another purpose of the legal research is like that. Then at the same time, if there is any law which is in existence, then to critically examine that provision, legal provision or legal principle, or if there is certain doctrine, then that has to be examined critically in order to view and to see that what is the consistency and coherence with the society, or whether it is having some stability of law in the policies which are coming up. And then another purpose for which we do the research is just to undertake the social audit of law. in which one can come up with the forces and impact. Now I'm using two words, forces and impact. So the reason for the existing law as to why and how it was made, and that is to say, what were the pre-legislative forces. Forces means that why the law has been made and what were the conditions at that time when the law was made, because every law that is coming in the society, that is the demand of the society. So what were the conditions at that particular time when that particular law has been made? So what were those pre-legislative forces and conditions on the basis of which that law has been enacted? And also to see the application of that law, the implementation of that law, that is to say the post-legislative impacts. So basically, two things which we do in the legal research is the pre-legislative forces and the post-legislative impacts. And if there is no law, then to give the suggestions for the making of the new laws, for improvement in the law, for the development of the law. So all these things are related to the research particularly and legal research specifically also. And there emerges some of the questions like why the law is made, what are the causes, what are the reasons and objectives that has activated the particular law, what are the cross and counter currents in the society that have opposed the particular law or not, what were the grounds of the opposition, how the law was adopted at that particular moment, and what are the effects of its implementation, that is the law successful or is the law unsuccessful as a social legislation. So there are various questions which are the problem or which are the area, which are the subject matter on which the researcher can work. And you see that we are in a welfare state, we are having a democratic state. So in that welfare and democratic state, there is a need for socio-economic transformation, just to bring the social order or just social order. This is important, which is based on the equality and the socio-economic justice also. So for social reform and for economic progress of the society, legislations and legal authorities are required. And for this, our constitution also allows the state to use its legislative function, legislative power to make the laws, to change the laws, so that the socio-economic transformation of that particular social order may be brought in the society. So law therefore acts as an agent for such socio-economic transformation. And as I told you that nothing is static, so is the case with the society also. So social economic transformation also requires different laws at different time. So the law which has been made at one point of time may not be relevant for all the time to come. And for that, their implementation, their application has to be seen. That has to be examined. And this is the work of the researcher, that where there is any lacuna, and on that lacuna, the researcher can suggest any development or even suggest the improvement or suggest the new or a model law for that particular problem on which the researcher is doing his research. So researcher has many questions to answer in the research work when he or she starts researching on a particular problem, that whether the law is fully implemented or not, or it is implemented, but it is implemented partially. If it is implemented partially, then why it is implemented partially? What corrective measures need to be taken to make it more and more effective? What stringent provisions are to be included? What are those provisions which are not making it properly functioning? So it means that the researcher has to suggest all these answers or all these solutions in the existing provision. I should say that when we find that the legal research, that is a process of identifying and retrieving some of the information and the information that are necessary to support the legal decision making also. It includes in each step as a course of action which the researcher has to follow. And that begins with the analysis of the facts of a problem, and which concludes with the application of and at the same time the dissemination of the results of the research also. So research takes into its ambit both the doctrinal research and the empirical research. Doctrinal research, the research is into legal rules, principles, concepts, and doctrines, and it involves the very systematic exposition and analysis and critical evaluation of the legal rules, legal principles, and their interrelationship also. So it is a library-based research which is based on the legal principles, legal rules, which are there in the documented form, doctrinal research. While empirical research, that is always there with the legal research, and it assesses the impact of the subjects, it assesses the impact of the law, and it also reveals the gap between the idealism and reality, the legal idealism and social reality, because every law is for the society. So what the legal principles are there, whether they are idealistic principles, they cannot be implemented in the society to bring the reality. That is the purpose of the empirical research, just to see the impact and to assess the impact of the subject and the law, and to reveal or to point out the gap between the idealism and reality, which is related to the legal idealism and social reality. So perceiving the idea of law as a social phenomena. A researcher explores the social, political, economic, and cultural dimensions and its implications of the subject. So these broad categories of the legal research, whether doctrinal legal research or non-doctrinal legal research or empirical legal research, they obviously are not mutually exclusive. They overlap each other. It cannot be said that if the student or the researcher is working on the empirical research method, then he would not be adopting the doctrinal research method. That is not exclusive. So in both ways, he has to work upon. They overlap each other because every research begins with a question or with a problem of some sort. Whether to be done in doctrinal method or in empirical method. So the aim of the research is just to know something more and something extra, something about something. That is that the earlier researchers have done some work and there are certain areas on which they have left, or there are certain areas on which there is no work. So the aim is just to search something more about something, or to discover the answers to meaningful questions through the application of scientific procedures. And legal research is also not an exception to this general concept of research. There are broadly, we can say, three main strategies in the legal process, which every researcher has to follow. And if the researcher follow these strategies, then of course the results and the solutions would be in the right direction. And each one of them needs a greater degree of skill also. Because research is a matter of aptitude. Research is a matter of interest. Research is something in which the researcher has to put entire skill so that something new, something good, something correct may come out. And these strategies includes like there must be a research planning, there must be the research implementation and presenting of research findings. So out of these broad three strategies comes various steps of the research. So the first strategy, that is research planning. And in that research planning, that requires the necessary sub-skills for fact collection, legal analysis, legal knowledge, problem identification, then analysis of the facts, analysis of the law, and further fact collections, then identification of the avenues of the research, and you see the generation of the key words or the search words. So first of all, at the first stage, a researcher has to plan as to how to go about a particular research, and for that, first of all, the skill is very much required. So that skill that includes the fact collection on the topic, on the area of the interest on which the researcher want to work, then he or she must have to collect the facts. And then after collecting the facts, the legal material, if any, has to be collected, that has to be analyzed, and the researcher must have the knowledge of that particular topic or the problem identification on which he or she wants to work. And then if he or she finds that the matter is not sufficient, then to find further fact collection is to be there, identification that where from the research material can be available. And in that way, the researcher has to point out with the generation of certain keywords that for example, if on medical negligence he has to work, if on the food right to food he has to work upon, or for example domestic violence he has to work upon, then some of the keywords are to be identified so that the material can be searched on that particular keywords, or that the material can be searched on that, so that if the keywords would be there, then the generation of the material can be there. So the first stage or the first strategy is just to plan a good research, and that is known as the research planning. Then at the second stage or the second strategy is the research implementation. As this is the second stage of the process, and that involves the skill of which is related to the identification of the problems for the resolution, identification of the relevant research source materials, and location of the source materials, from where from the source has to be collected and the data has to be collected, and then effective use of that source material. It is not only that you are collecting the data, you have the compilation of the number of literature, or you have the compilation of various books and other articles for your research work, but how do you use that material? You are using that material effectively or not? So research implementation is a great work of the skill of the researcher to use that effectively, the source material which has been collected at the first stage of planning. And then analysis of that research findings, whatever findings have come out by the use of the source material, by the research of the researcher, then how to analyze those research findings, that is also coming under the research implementation. And then application of the findings to the identified problems and identification of the problems. So all these are coming in the second strategy of the researcher, which every researcher, it's not confined only to the legal research, but every researcher has to perform this research implementation. And finally, when all first and second stage completes, then presentation of the research findings. So that requires the skills which are necessary for the identification of the research recipients' needs. For whom the research is being made, what is the cause of that research, what are the particular objectives of the research, and who are the research subjects also, who are the research recipients also. So what are their needs and how the result is or research findings are to be presented to them. So this is the third strategy which a researcher must also be keeping in mind while presenting the research findings. And for that, the selection of appropriate format is required, the framework is required, the use of clear and lucid language which is understandable by all. So everybody can write a very good English, which is very literary in nature. Everybody could speak very good English, which is literary in nature. But what is the purpose of all these things? That is, you want to convey something to those, and that should be in a language which should be easily understood by those persons. And that's why the language which is used by the researcher, or which a researcher is to use, that must be very clear, that must be simple, that must be understandable, and that must be very, very lucid language. And the use of the appropriate language is also important in the research findings presentation. That is, what shall be the style of your presentation, whether it is going to be informatory in nature, it is going to be advisory in nature, it is going to be recommendatory in nature, or you are demanding something. So it is depending upon the format of your research, whether it is a research article, it is a dissertation, it's a PhD thesis, it's a project work. Depending upon that, your style and the formatting also changes according to the framework which you are having. If you are a student of a one university or the other university, they may have different formats, they may have different frameworks also. So the findings and the presentation of your research would be in that format only. And that is one of the important strategy which every researcher must follow, because ultimately what impacts is your presentation of the research findings. It's not that what you did in the earlier stages. You have started right from identification or formulation of the problem, and then data analysis, research, then many stages you have completed, but that stages are not going to make any effect on the society, that are not going to make any impact on the research subjects or the recipients. But the presentation of your research finding is very important, because that goes in the hands of the society, that is available to the others to see as to how the research findings are coming up and how they are there, to find that really it's a good research. So from these three strategies, that is the research planning, research implementation, and the presenting of the research findings, we find that if we do a cumulative reading of all these three, then we find that their components leads to major stages and major steps which a researcher has to follow in the research process. So as I told you that broadly, these major steps of the research are identification and the formulation of the research problem, and then literature review is there, formulation of the hypothesis, research design, and for that the data has to be collected, and if the data is collected, then what to do with that data. The data has to be analyzed. Once the data is analyzed, then that has to be interpreted also, and then you have to write the research report, or as I told you, the research findings presentation. So it may be in the shape of the report, it may be in the shape of the recommendations, it may be in the shape of the suggestions, conclusive remarks also. So all these steps are not mutually exclusive, they overlap continuously, and it is not required to follow the prescribed sequence also strictly. And the order is only just to provide the procedural guidelines for the research. So you can work upon various steps simultaneously, but the ultimate result of your research is what that is important. So if we see the procedure of the research or various steps of the research, then the first step is the identification and the formulation of a research problem. So as you see that one cannot work in vacuum. There must be some question to answer, or there must be some problem to solve. So a research problem is a statement about an area of the concern. That is a condition which is to be improved, or there may be some difficulty which needs to be eliminated, or there are certain troubling questions that exist in the literature or in theory or in practice, and that points to the need for meaningful understanding, and that requires some deliberate investigation. So identification and formulation of the research problem is simply to answer certain questions, to solve certain problems, to investigate certain problems, and to give a meaningful understanding to that. So identification and formulation of a research problem is the starting point of a research. As I told you, that we cannot work in vacuum. So until and unless there is a problem, then you cannot proceed further. So for that, the starting point, the first step or the first stage for a researcher is that there must be some identification or formulation of a research problem. And it is the very first step in any research work. And if you wish that your research may be successful, it will depend on the selection of a correct research problem and its proper formulation. So the research problem must be such that must create interest of the researcher in the problem. The interest is very important. It is an old saying and wise also, that a problem well put is half solved. And an ill-identified and imperfect or a weak formulated research problem will make the researcher to lose his interest. As the research problem is not suitable to work because of its bad choice or incorrect identification and formulation, this may compel the researcher to leave in between, even to abdicate his research halfway, because there is no interest of the researcher. It also lends the researcher nowhere in a number of unanticipated difficulties at a later stage, because the researcher is not having the interest in the research problem. So it is required that research problem should be goal oriented, it should be goal directed also. And if the goal itself is unknown or it is not identified, it is not defined clearly, the researcher will lead to the research nowhere. So a well-defined and precise research problem for meaningful research is the first stage of the research. But the question is that, can we say that identification and the formulation of research is a problem, is an easy work or easy task for the researcher? And for me, it is not a easy work. It is not very easy task for the researcher, because in most of the scientific works, you see the difficulty lies in framing of the problem rather than finding the solution for those problems. So if your problem is well formulated, if the problem is well identified, only then there would be a good research, only then there would be a good result of that particular research, because it is more difficult to find and to formulate a problem than to solve it. And as a researcher, therefore, you need to constantly remind yourself that you need to put your research problem or research question in a very, very precise way. It should not be very wide. You should be very, very firm in deciding and formulating your research problem, that it should be a very precise and it should be very limited problem on which you are going to work, you want to work, and to formulate it in such a way so that it becomes viable, and it allows you the discovery of new facts, new knowledge, new solutions. Because whatever is already done, you cannot work on that line on again. You have to work on some new lines. So some discovery of new knowledge, new facts is very essential, and that's why the formulation of the problem is very essential. Because before formulating a research problem, it is however also necessary for the researcher in sequence to identify the area of his general interest. As I told you that to formulate a research problem, one thing is important, that is the interest of the researcher. And for that interest, the interest has further to be identified, that what is the general interest of the researcher. For example, in law, if I say that the general interest of the researcher is just to work on the personal laws or family laws or on public law. So this is the general, or on cyber law, or for that purpose, IPR, intellectual property laws. So this is the general interest. Now an area or the subject matter of his special interest from the area of general interest has to be taken. For example, if I'm talking about the public law, then in public law, the constitutional law, he wants to work, or administrative law, he wants to work. In personal law, the researcher wants to work in the Hindu law or in the Muslim law, or in IPR, the researcher wants to work in the patent law or in the copyright law or in geographical indication. So from general interest to the special interest, that has to be sorted out by the researcher, or identify the area of the interest. And as an aspect from the subject matter of his special interest, because special interest may be of a particular, for example, copyright law, for example, Hindu law, then from that subject matter of the special interest, that would that he would like to inquire into, he has to come out on this particular subject also. For example, if he wants to work on the Hindu law, then whether it is related to the succession, it is related to the divorce, it is related to the marriage, it is related to the adoption, or if the researcher wants to work in the copyright law, then he wants to work in the fair use matter, he wants to work on the grounds, and he wants to work on the neighboring right, many other things. For example, if he decides to work in public law, and in public law to the constitutional law, then in constitutional law he wants to work in fundamental rights, or in duties, in trade and commerce, in amendment, emergency, many choices may be there, many interests may be there, special interests. So this is not enough for him to formulate a research problem. General interest, special interest, subject-wise interest, but that subject-wise would also be not sufficient, and that would not be enough to formulate the research problem. Researcher needs to select a particular topic that interests him more. From this subject matter interest, he has to identify an aspect of that particular interest, and only then he can proceed further for proving or for proceeding for his research. For example, if he chooses fundamental rights, then in that fundamental rights, which fundamental right he want to work? Right to privacy and social media, right to health during pandemic. If you want to work in the family laws, then child marriage, or in trade laws, then GST and trade law, and many more focused problems that are to be identified by the researcher. So he has for that identifying the problem, what is required, the researcher has to do a lot of reading. A lot of reading to identify for further inquiry. That is formulating a statement of problem. Without reading, one cannot make a problem, research problem, one cannot formulate or identify a research problem, because the problem will not come in a vacuum. The problem will not come in blank. If the researcher is not aware about the things, then where that problem may come. So for that, a lot of reading, a lot of study material that is required, so that if the researcher can identify and then formulate the research problem. So it needs to put in such a way that it signifies the focus of inquiry as well as its direction also, that what the researcher wants to inquire into that problem, and how that researcher will proceed in the particular direction, so that it may come out with meaningful results, with meaningful solutions in that research. And for that, it is required that a lot of reading is also required for the by the researcher, and a research problem must be worthy for study also, that is also to be seen. And at the same time, it must be of relevance, that is social relevance, legal relevance should be there of that problem on which the researcher want to work. And at the same time, it is also required that the whatever research problem the researcher is going to formulate and identify, that must be a current problem, up-to-date problem. It is not like that what was happened in 1930 and the researcher want to work, particularly in legal arena. We say that Whatever is the current, whatever is up to date, whatever is coming today, latest things are to be identified, and on that problem the researcher can formulate and work upon. So the problem must also be researchable. It must be verifiable and testable, so that whatever problem is there, if the researcher wants to pursue and to proceed for that, it must be testable through various hypothetication, and on that basis he should come out with some solution. So importantly, very importantly, the researcher has to study a lot and lot, study material, reading material, to make or to formulate a research problem which is worthy for study, which is of social and legal relevance, which is current in nature, and which is researchable and testable at the same time, which may come out with some solutions. And finally, it should be original problem also. The problem must not be like just copy and paste from the earlier researches, but it should have some originality. That is also one of the important things. So the first step is just to formulate a research plan. And the strategy of your must be to consider the preliminary questions, the legal questions that you need to answer, the parties and the relationship between the parties, the areas of law and jurisdiction on which you want to work, and most relevant facts and the legal terms which you need to use for your research. Generate the search terms before you begin your research. This all will help to you in order to proceed further for your research, to navigate your indexes and table of contents, conduct the keyword researches, and it will create both natural language and terms and the connector terms in such terms. Because if you read any book, then you will find the footnotes, the references. So the natural language or the terms or the main content you will be finding in particular book, but connector such terms you will be finding in the footnotes and the references. That is also very important for the researcher. So you may not be able to answer every preliminary question, and that is okay, there is no problem. But part of your research process is identifying known and unknown information and answer what you can and move for further research if you are not able to answer. So you may have to read some more material to reach to the answer of unknown informations and unknown questions. So the steps in research problem formulations are: identify broad field or subject area of your interest, dissect the broad area into sub areas, then select in which you have more interest, prepare the research question, what do you want to do, and then formulate the objectives of your research problem, like to find, to examine, and to determine. These should be your objectives with that research problem. Then assess your objectives, assessment in terms of the time within which you want to complete your research work, whether your research work is having some financial burden also. So what are the financial resources, where from you are getting the financial resources, or technical expertise you have or not, because everything is now coming up with the technicality. So how much technical expertise you are having. So assess your objectives in reference to these points also. That if it's a PhD, then 4 years. If it's a dissertation, 6 months or 1 year. If it's a project, then 1 year to 3 years. So time duration is always very important to assess the objective of your research. Then financial resources and technical expertise are always important to assess your objectives. And finally, you have to check and recheck. You have to reassess your problem on which you want to proceed further. Because if the problem that is really one on which you want to work, you wish to work out of your interest, it should be your problem. It should be your interest area. It should not be the area of the interest of your supervisor. because in many of the universities, in many of the departments, I have seen that the area on which the researcher works, they work on the research area of their supervisors, because the supervisors don't want to study more, because they cannot guide beyond their expertise area. So the interest area of the researcher must be his own. It should not be the supervisor's area, so that if the area of interest would not be of the researcher, then the research may be complete or not. It would be depending on the research interest of the particular researcher. So the first stage is the formulation and identification of the research. The second step, or the next step, is the review of literature. Because to formulate the problem, the literature has to be reviewed, the literature has to be seen and studied. Once the research problem is identified and defined, once the research problem is formulated, the next step is to review the existing research. And you need to undertake an extensive survey of the literature also. The researcher must learn more about the topic under research. To do this, the researcher must review the literature which is related to the research problem. And this step provides some foundational knowledge, some basic knowledge, some base for that knowledge in which the researcher want to work, or related to his problem area on which the researcher want to work, which is basically connected to the research problem, which is related to, or which is having some bearing on the research problem. So this step, that is the review of literature, is important just to proceed further and to have certain idea about the research problem on which the researcher has to further work upon. And this is the process whereby you locate and you select the references that are relevant for your research also. And the review of literature also educates the researcher about what studies have been conducted in the past, how these studies were conducted, and the conclusions in the problem area have been reached upon. So at this stage, it is important to carefully trace the standard textbooks, standard reference books which are dealing with or having some bearing with your research problem. You have to look into legal periodicals or some other social periodicals to locate the research articles which have been written by some authorities, or some comments have been made therein which is related to your subject, and also allied subjects. It's not that you have to target only with the research problem, but because the problem is a social problem, it's a legal problem, and which the results or the solutions may come from the society. So you have to have the research articles which are from the other subjects also, which will relate to your research problem. Then the case reports, conference, symposium, seminars, proceedings, commissions reports, government reports, and judgments in original and other existing material. These are all the materials which you need to review in this stage, in this second step of the research. And you see that the literature review process now is changed because of the access to computers, and specifically because of this www World Wide Web, because everything is now available on your tips. Whenever you want, you can put one single word, and then in search results you can find everything which is related to your problem. But you see that using the web can be the basis of literature review, but it needs to be balanced with material very new, published in journals and periodicals, that are not put on the web, and the publications that might not have been caught by search engines, which are not available for the open access. Because when you do the Google research or some other search engine through which you want to take certain material, then every work related to that particular problem is not available, because there are certain works which are having the open access of the research work. So that is one point. Any other question? So literature review makes the researcher conversant with the materials available on his research problem, and it is also make the researcher having different aspects, different dimensions of the problem. What is the theoretical basis of the problem, or what are the relevant theories in the field. So all these are coming with the literature review because it helps the researcher to know and to have the first information and knowledge about that particular problem. And this is how the literature review is the second step in which the researcher has to take out certain data and certain other material which he or she wants to use in the research. So what methods have been used to obtain the data, and what difficulties that is having with the earlier researcher in collecting and analyzing the data that have been faced. So the literature in literature review, the researcher has to work on certain purposes, like to reveal what has been done and written on the topic in the earlier or in the past or by the earlier researcher, just to map with the limitations and the research techniques used in that particular work. So what were the limitations in the earlier research, and how that limitations can be successful in the new research that has to be seen through the literature review, and to know that the kind of the material, the data that has been used, and their resources and various sources on which the earlier researcher has worked upon, and then to find out and to make certain patterns of the presentations and the arguments which the earlier researcher has done. So avoid that and then to proceed further, and that could be done only if the researcher is having a good number of literature for its review. And then at the same time, some secondary data or secondary sources can also be consulted by the researcher, depending on your familiarity with the particular area of the subject on which you are going to research. If it is law, then you can consult different type of the secondary sources. For example, you can consult the legal encyclopedia, law reports, law journals. You can also have some subject specific secondary resources like books on the particular area. Then subject specific law journals, like if you are going to work in IPR, then IPR journal, labor cases in labor law, labor journals, then domestic violence cases or some divorce or matrimonial cases. So different types of the specific law journals are always there. So that can also be reviewed during the literature review. And as you develop your knowledge of a particular area, which is subject specific, the secondary sources also become more useful. And then when you do this literature survey, then can you move for consulting the primary sources, and the secondary sources you consulted earlier will lead you directly to the primary sources also via references and via footnotes, as I just told you. Then once you find the relevant primary sources, those primary sources should lead you to other relevant primary sources also, and the codes, the regulations, the case laws, and other sections, secondary sources, everything you will find in your literature review. And then you can determine that where there is more recent laws and acts are there, those can be discussed by you in your research work. So literature review includes all types of the literature, whether it is devoted to the primary source or it is devoted to the secondary source. So you can have that in your literature as a review, and then you can get an idea regarding your problem. That this is the law which was existing, this is the literature which was in existence, this is the research which was in existing, in existence, and now you have to proceed further. You have to do something new out of that. You have to do something original out of that. You have not to follow that, but you have to do something different from the earlier work. So that is how you can rely on the review of literature. Then the next step is the formulation of a hypothesis. Hypothesis where it is feasible. In every research, legal research, it is not required that there should be a formulation of hypothesis. There may be research questions only, and hypotheses are not required for all the research, legal research. So after expensive literature survey, literature review, the researcher has to proceed and has to formulate or reformulate his research problem if necessary, and then has to proceed for making or formulating the research hypothesis. So in this step, the researcher makes the problem precise. The research work is the topic focused and refined. And this stage, the researcher forwards as to how the problem would be approached, how the researcher would proceed on that particular problem. The nature of the research problem can decide and to formulate a definite hypothesis. A hypothesis is tested, effective research work formulates a hypothesis, and that is in such a way that the collected factual data that will provide evidence, and that may either support your problem, that may disprove your problem. That is depending upon the work on which you are proceeding further. So the validity of the hypothesis is unknown in the beginning. When you proceed for your research, only then the result comes, and then you will be able to know that your hypothesis is supporting your research problem or it is disproving your research problem. So such a proposition, that is known as the hypothesis. And it is merely a tentative assumption, we all know, which is made in order to draw and test its logical and empirical consequences. It is tentative, it is a testable statement only. A statement to be a hypothesis must be capable of being tested. If it is not testable, then it cannot be a hypothesis. So if its validity cannot be put to the empirical confirmation, a proposition, howsoever it is attractive or interesting, it may cease to be a hypothesis. So formulation of hypothesis in research will make you more expert. It serves as a framework to draw your conclusions. And in the end, the hypothesis turns into a practical theory, which you present in your writing of the report. So basically, there are different types of the hypothesis on the basis of their functioning. Like there may be a descriptive hypothesis, there may be a working hypothesis, statistical hypothesis may be there, relational hypothesis may be there, and sometimes null hypothesis may be there, because if there is a hypothesis on which you have started working and the results which are coming out are of such a nature which you can ignore, then you can go for that as a null hypothesis also. So the manner in which a hypothesis is formulated is very important, and it gives significant clues also about the research, about the kind of the data which is required, the type of the methods which are to be used for collecting the data, and the method of the analysis to be used in your research work. That is important if the formulation of the hypothesis is good. And it also guides the researcher by delimiting the area of research, and that also keeps the researcher on the right track throughout his work. Because the researcher has in his or her mind the hypothesis that on this particular problem he has to work upon, then he can work on that line only and will not be revolving here and there for that purpose. And it sharpens the thinking and the focus attention of the researcher also, so that he can prove the facts and different facets of the problem which are there under research. And in this way, we can say that a hypothesis to be worked. Should I proceed further?
Yes, madam, no issues.
Okay. So the next step is research design. And after defining a research problem and formulating the hypothesis, the researcher has to work out a design for the study. And this research design is the conceptual structure within which the research is conducted. It is something which is said to be a planning of research or a systematic and logical planning of research. And this term research design that refers to the entire process of planning and how the research is to be carried out. So this is a process of visualizing or the conducting of the empirical research also. And before the commencement of the research or before the starting of the research, the entire process, how to conduct the research is the step which is known as the research design. Or you can say that this research design is like a blueprint of your proposed research on which the researcher want to proceed further. So this blueprint is tentative in nature, as the researcher may not be able to foresee as what is going to come in near future, all the contingencies of the future. So before starting the work, so this is something like tentative designing of your research, and in which the researcher is allowed to meet these contingencies when it comes across, and then his research work may be improved according to the conditions. And this helps the researcher to identify in advance the kinds of the data he requires, the means to collect that data, the methods which are to be used for analyzing and for interpreting the data, the presentation of the findings with more and more accuracy. This research design also helps the researcher to minimize the uncertainties. And if there is any confusion, if there is any practical hazard which is associated with the research problem, then this research design will help the researcher to work in the line on the basis of which that structure has been made by the researcher at the initial stage. So that research design is like a structure of your research on the basis of which the researcher moves further. And it also decides how the research materials will be collected, and one or more research methods like experiment can be done, surveys can be done, interviews can be done, questionnaires may be taken, schedules may be fixed. So there are various methods through which the data can be collected, and it may be chosen by the researcher. It is depending upon the research objectives and the purposes on the basis of which the researcher proceeds to work upon, because the purpose may be exploratory, the purpose may be based on the exploration of the problem, it may be based on the description of that problem only, it may be having some diagnostic basis, or it may be having the experimentation basis. So on the basis of the purpose of that research, the data can be collected through various methods, and that has to be there in the research design also. Then as I told you, different tools of the data collection in the empirical study, like interviews, observations, document analysis may be there, schedules may be there, participation through observation can be there. Then there may be some online surveys, some Google forms which are now coming up. During last 2 years, we are seeing that because of this pandemic, everything has gone online. So the researchers are also being gone online, and the data is being collected through Google Forms. So it is not always easy to take the right decision in that way, but it is crucial decision which is far-reaching effect and consequences on the outcome of the research. And for that, the researcher has to prepare that data collection method very importantly as to how to collect that data. And the methods which he chooses will ultimately determine the quality and the propriety of that data, which will also be following the results of that particular research. So in that way, what do we see is that while selecting the methods of data collection, The researcher has to take into account the objectives of his research and the nature and scope of the inquiry. Data can be primary or secondary, and it can be collected by the researcher by using the primary sources or by the secondary sources, by published form which is available there, or some by direct interview, etc. So in either case, the researcher has to select an appropriate method of data collection. So once the data is collected, after that data collection, the researcher has to analyze the data which is in any form. It may be raw data, and it may be neutral data, it may be documented data, whatever type of the data is there, that has to be analyzed by the researcher. And then analysis of data comes prior to the interpretation. So, however, there is no clear-cut dividing line also between analysis and interpretation. But once you are getting the data has been collected, then once you have to analyze the data, analyzing on the basis of the various classifications, like there may be categories, there may be some age group, there may be certain tabulation, coding, so many things are there. And then after analyzing that data, one can interpret that data. So a proper method is that first to analyze the data and then to interpret the data. And classification or categorization of data is the process that is arranging the data in groups or classes according to their age, according to their sexual orientation, according to their affinity, according to their gender. So many things are there on the basis of which the data can be categorized and classified for the purpose of analysis and for the purpose of interpretation. And the researcher has to classify the data into required categories. Categorization has to be based on the problem under a study or the hypothesis which has been formulated. For example, if it is related that what are the rights of the senior citizens, for example, then the data which is collected, then particularly women senior citizen or male senior citizen, then it has to be categorized and classified accordingly. Then the category must also be exhaustive and suitable for classifying all the responses. So this is very important task for giving a proper research finding by the researcher, that after the data collection, how the data has to be analyzed and how that data which is analyzed has to be interpreted. And that interpretation is the result of your entire thesis. So interpretation is considered as one of the basic components of the research, and it refers to the task of drawing inference from the collected data. And the inference may be deductive, it may be inductive. The deductive involves the inference from generally abstract propositions to particular ones, and the inductive is the inference from particular propositions to the general proposition. So through this interpretation of the data, the researcher just try to attempt and to search the broader meaning of the research findings, and a researcher through his interpretation tries to find and understand the abstract principles that works in his finding. So the process of interpretation may quite often bring new questions that may lead to further researches. In fact, the usefulness of the utility of the research lie in the proper interpretation of the collected data and the fact. If the data are properly collected and analyzed, but interpretation is wrong, then that would lead to inaccurate or misleading conclusions even. So interpretation must be impartial and objective. There should not be any falsification or fabrication of data. If the data is falsified, if the data is fabricated by the researcher, then the results would not be correct, and that would be misleading to the society for the purpose for which the research is being conducted. So a researcher should explain why his findings are so in objective terms.
Madam, shall I ask a small question, madam?
Sorry to disturb. Sure.
Madam, if I am interpreting the data, and while interpreting, there is always a threat of my particular analysis not long lasting, madam. Because that data, what I have collected, may be so irrelevant for the next year because basic data on which my interpretations are there are absolutely, dynamic and they keep changing.
Yeah.
So what caution the researcher should take, madam, concerning to this less time for my interpretation to last after the submission of the thesis?
Okay. Basically, this happens in the area where there are things are very fastly changing. And so far as the interpretation of that particular data, that is dependent on the data which is collected by you in the form of different, by applying different tools for data collection. So analysis of the data and the interpretation of data would be confining only to that data which is collected by you. It is not to be in reference to the other things which are surrounding therein. Your data that you have collected, you can analyze, you can interpret your data. It is not material that how much life that data would have, because in the changing scenario, the data may be changed. There is no problem. And that's why it is not something which we say that once a research is for every time to come, for all the time to come. Research is something which is already being searched by others. So whatever research you are doing, if it is successful for 1 year or 2 years, or for that matter 1 month, not material. But at the time when you are analyzing, you are interpreting your data, that should be only that data which you have collected through your resources, through your sources, and nothing else. That is the clear thinking of the data, and that is the accurate data which you are having. That may not mislead the society, because your data collection is something different, and you are thinking that because it is going to change, the society is being changed, then the analysis or interpretation can be changed. No. For that purpose, you have to collect another data. If it is so frequently changing, then you can collect the fresh data also. According to that situation, you can analyze that. But as I told you that in the beginning also, while making your research design, the time period is also very important. So what type of research you are doing? Because one of my student, she was doing her research on cyber crimes, and at that time there were nothing like any law, any guidelines, OECD guidelines, and when she submitted her thesis, and it was not awarded at that time. In between, those guidelines have been passed and the entire work was going to be futile. So it is not like that, if the data which you have collected and that is going to be changed, but if you have sufficient time, you collect a fresh data and then analyze accordingly, then interpret accordingly. There is no reason to change and to mislead the others by making a wrong interpretation of your data. The interpretation must be a correct interpretation. You must analyze it properly.
Thank you, madam.
Okay. So because the accuracy is very important with your interpretation, and that accuracy would not lead to any false or any incorrect conclusions, which is very important, because interpretation must always be impartial and objective. And the researcher should explain as to how he has interpreted that data, and what was the objective for interpreting that data, and what the skills which have been used by the researcher in coming out to that particular data, and that all speaks about the experience and the practice of the researcher on the basis of which he collected and analyzed the data. And then finally, the writing of the research report. So this is the last phase or the last step of the research in writing the research report. And it is one of the major component of the research, because whatever you do, that must be published. And if whatever you have done for the 1 year to 4 year or 5 year or more than that time, then your work must be come to the society, must come to the public, so that they can also be benefited with your research. So this is one of the major component of the research, that is the writing of the research report and the conclusion part of that report. and research will not be complete without the report written by the researcher. Though we see that research report, the researcher communicates and tells what he did, what are his findings. It is just like an account of the journey of the researcher as to how he did start his research and how he proceeded for his research, what he did and how he came to a particular conclusion. So this is the entire timeline of the research on which the researcher want to produce in the research report. Then we see that it contains an account of the statement of problem which is investigated by the researcher, the procedure which has been adopted by the researcher, and the findings on which he has arrived for. And it contains the significant facts that are necessary to appreciate and understand the generalizations which has been drawn by him. And researcher through his research report just share the research problem which has been investigated and the methods which have been used by him, and the collection of data, analysis and interpretation, and the results or the finding of the study. So the purpose of the research report is just to convey to the interested persons particularly and generally all the whole result of the inquiry, the whole result of the research in detail. And the contents and the styles of the report are depending upon the kind of the authority, upon the kind of the persons, on the basis of the audience which intends to be addressed. Because if it is an article you are publishing in a newspaper, the audience would be different. If it is a legal article or research article, the audience would be different. If it is the PhD thesis, the audience would be different. If it is a dissertation, the audience would be different. So your content and style of reporting or writing the report is depending on the person for whom it is being addressed. You cannot be, there cannot be any hard and fast rules which are pertaining to the contents and the format of a research report. But a research report must be written in such a manner that the reader can understand the context, the methodology, and the findings very easily. So a research report generally must contain the information about the problem which is undertaken by the researcher, the objectives for which it has been undertaken by the researcher, what methodology has been adopted by the researcher to inquire into, to investigate into the particular research topic and problem, and the analysis and inferences of the research queries which have been made by the researcher. What are their theoretical aspects and implications? What are their practical implications? If it is an empirical study, of course, the practical implications may also be there. For example, if an inquiry is on the LGBT rights, then what practical problems and have been faced by the researcher? That is also one of the aspect which can be written in the report. Similarly, in case of the persons who are suffering with HIV positive, or the women who are divorced or who have been deserted. So similar type of the things, the various types of the practical implications may be faced by the researcher. So that may be the part of the report also. And a proper format of legal research report has three major parts basically. As I told you, preliminary pages may be there, then second is the main text, and third is the end matter. So at the first place, the researcher has to put the acknowledgement, preface, table of contents, table of cases, statutes, abbreviations, list of tables and annexures, everything which is there, which the acts which have been used, the commission reports, whatever material has been used, and questionnaires also if the format is there then. And the second part is relating to the main text, in which the researcher has to write with appropriate headings the introduction, starting from the introduction till the conclusion and suggestions, various chapters, empirical research, reporting, analysis, everything chapter wise has to be given. And Each chapter has to have necessary headings, subheadings with proper documentation in the form of footnotes. Then footnoting styles may be different. It depends upon the particular institution that the researcher has to use the MLA method of footnoting, APA method, ILI, OSCOLO, Chicago, Blue Book. Many types of the footnoting or reference methods are there. So which is to be for there, the formatting needs to be the same in all the chapters. Then chapter should be written in very concise and simple language. And lastly, the researcher has to place the bibliography, different texts like statutory provisions or some main text which have been referred there in some interviews, questionnaires, etc., which are used by the researcher in collecting the data in the form of the annexes and index, etc. So in these three parts, the researcher has to put his entire work of the research, and very importantly, the originality and the clarity are two vital components of the research report. It is the ultimate test of one's analytical ability and communication skills. It is an exercise which involves the organization of the ideas, the organization of thoughts. So one paragraph and two paragraph, there must be a linkage between these two. It is not like that in one paragraph you are writing something different, in the second paragraph you are writing something different. So the two paragraphs must have a link, and that is how you can organize your ideas in that. And reporting the research requires skills somewhat different from those needed in the earlier phases of the research. And you need to be very careful while analyzing the writing of the report, and that is how you can reach to the final outcome of your research. And with that, I would like to stop myself here, and once again thanks to the organizers so that I could share my views with the participants. I would be happy if there would be some more questions on what I have spoken so far. Thank you very much.